So I will go ahead and get started. My name is Marnie. I'm the director of the Shawnee Tribe Cultural Center. Welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. With us is Natalie Wadley, who is our exhibits and program manager, and of course our guest speaker, Andrew. And I will let you say your name, Andrew, just briefly.
Andrew Szarejko.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Great, Joe. All right. So just to give you a little bit of information about the order of operation, Andrew is going to give his presentation. I, of course, apologize for any technical difficulties we have, any potential alien invasions or other phenomenon that prevents us having a smooth presentation. And if you have any questions, if you could just type them into the chat box, you can do that as the lecture is being presented, and Natalie at the end will read the questions for Andrew so he can answer them. Our next lecture, we have one set up for next month. It is Ed Herman with Indiana University, and he'll be talking about angel mounds, which is in Indiana, particularly about mound alignments, like celestial alignments. I've gotten a little brief kind of preview of his talk, and it's fascinating. I highly recommend it. It will be March 18th at 12 p.m. noon Central Time. So kind of more of a lunch presentation, but in case you miss it, it will be later posted on our website, YouTube, with captions. And now I will introduce Andrew, who I have met. He actually reached out to me way back in 2019, and he visited Miami and interviewed citizens as he was working on his PhD dissertation at Georgetown University. And I forgot to mention, apologize for cats. He is currently a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Cincinnati. He teaches courses in international relations and comparative politics, and his work has been published in outlets such as the Journal of Global Security Studies, American Indian Quarterly, and Indian Country Today. I really enjoyed working with him in his dissertation because I thought he had an interesting perspective, because it wasn't like anthropological or history. It was more political science based. So I'm happy he's joining us tonight to share some information with us. And we'll turn it over to Andrew.
Well, thank you, Marnie, for that kind introduction. I'm happy to be here with you all as well. I'll go ahead and share my screen for the presentation here. And as the title of the piece suggested, I'm going to be talking about Indigenous politics and looking at this from the perspective of US foreign policy. So as Marnie said, I'm a scholar of political science. I'll get into that in a moment. But that's going to be coming from a slightly different perspective than many of these studies of Indigenous politics are. But the first bit of context to mention here, as Marnie already mentioned, is that this presentation really comes out of my dissertation research. In the PhD program in government at Georgetown, I settled on this project ultimately about how individual conflicts between the United States and Native nations began. And so the dissertation, which I've given a copy of to Marnie to distribute as she sees fit. I'll come back to that in a bit. But this is really the first major academic work for me. If you attended last month's talk with Colin Calloway, we're at very different points in our respective academic careers. He was really giving a presentation summarizing decades worth of work on the Shawnee in particular. I'm just starting out in the field, and that's sort of where this project is coming from. The second bit of context to mention here again is that I'm coming from political science, and in particular from a study of international relations and US foreign policy. So whereas by contrast, Colin Calloway was coming from history, the goal there being essentially to give as detailed an understanding or accounting of all the possible things that happened in a given period relating to a given people, for example. What I and scholars of international relations are more interested in is trying to sort of understand the causes of different patterns of behavior in international politics, patterns of war and peace being sort of chief among the things that we're interested in. So this is going to sort of differ in the style and content than you might get from a historian or anthropologist, to be sure. Now, sorry. There we go. And to come, though, to the question that I want to frame this presentation with, and you may have seen this in the promotional materials for this talk. The question that I ultimately want to ask here and offer some tentative answers to is the question of how might our understanding of early US foreign policy change if we were to focus less on relations with European powers and more on relations with native nations. Now, as you would have gotten from that talk from Colin Calloway or from a lot of other work by historians, there is a lot of work out there exploring these relationships between the United States and different native nations across what is now the contiguous United States. That there's a lot of work out there on these topics, but it hasn't really been brought into the study of international relations and US foreign policy. More generally, when people in my field think about early US foreign policy, they're talking about things like US relations with France and Britain and Spain. And so what I'm trying to sort of puzzle through here is what might people who study US foreign policy get out of a closer study of these relationships. And so to outline the talk here, I'm going to first outline 3 myths of US foreign policy. I'm going to try to dispel those myths with 3 case studies. This is really the bulk of the work in my dissertation. These are going to be 3 different conflicts between the United States and native nations. And then once I go through the 3 case studies and the ways in which they perhaps make us rethink some of those myths of US foreign policy, I'll try to summarize with 3 broad implications, again, for our understanding of early US foreign policy. Now, the first myth, and I'm just going to briefly outline these here at first, is that foreign policy is for elites. And by this, I mean, we can sometimes think of foreign policy as something that politicians do. It's presidents, secretaries of defense or war, generals who ultimately make decisions for war and how to conduct war. By contrast, I'm going to be exploring some of the ways in which other actors might come into that foreign policy making process. Now, the second myth that I'm going to talk about is, I think, the biggest myth of the early US foreign policy, and that is that early US foreign policy was isolationist. I think that this is something that has pretty broad purchase among many who study American foreign policy. And so this is the one that I think scholars could use the most, or rather, it's the myth that's most in need of a strong corrective in this field. And then the third myth that I'm going to try to dispel here is that motivations are material. And I think that the first 2 are a bit more straightforward, but by this I mean there's a notion that most foreign policy action is ultimately motivated by concern for economic gain. It's about opening up and maintaining the existing markets that the United States wants to trade in. And I'm going to be suggesting that there are other sort of ideational, cultural, or ideological factors that we ought to bring into this as well. And all these myths, I'm going to argue, can be better sort of understood or, again, dispelled with reference to US relations with Native nations. And it's in that context that I'm going to bring in these three case studies. The first being the Northwest Indian War of 1790 to 95. This is the main case study involving the Shawnee. So if you want to get more into that one in Q&A than some of the others, I'm happy to do so. The second case study is going to be the Second Seminole War of 1835 to 42. And then the third one will be Utah's Black Hawk War of 1865 to 72. And I specify Utah's Black Hawk War here because there is an earlier Black Hawk War in the 1830s that takes place in what's now Illinois and Wisconsin. I won't be necessarily talking about that one today. But the important thing here to note is just that these are three different conflicts, all of which take place across about 80 years or so of American history that involve different tribes in different locations around the United States, or what is now the United States. And so to come to this first myth here, the first myth being that foreign policy is for elites. Again, I'm going to focus on the Northwest Indian War here. But I first want to mention some of the context for sort of how this plays out in the academic literature. And this is a book, for example, that I found very useful. It's a very helpful history of this particular conflict. I'll mention it in some suggestions for further reading. But the extent to which we assign an individual war to the decisions of an individual leader, I think can sometimes obscure the other actors that ultimately shape some of these outcomes as well. And alongside history, we have similar studies in international relations nowadays. These two books, I think, are representative of a trend over the past 10 years. Leaders at War by Elizabeth Saunders and Why Leaders Fight by Michael Horowitz, Alan Stam, and Callie Ellis. These are representative of a trend that focuses on individual leaders and the traits of those leaders that predispose them to war or not. And so you can sometimes, by sort of focusing on individual leaders, again, sort of lose focus on some of the other actors, like the public, that might come into this foreign policy making process. And even in those cases where we do have a study that does bring non-leaders into the question of foreign policy making, that taught specifically about the role of the public in foreign policy, like this book on war and democratic constraint, How the Public Influences Foreign Policy by Matthew Baum and Philip Potter. That's a book that ultimately sees the public mainly as an audience that renders judgment on decisions for war after the fact. And by contrast, what we're going to see here are decisions for war that can be shaped in some cases more directly by the public. So to come then to this first case study of the Northwest Indian War, I want to start with some earlier context. And this is, I believe, similar to a map that Colin Calloway had in his talk. This is, I think, one of the more important aspects of late colonial policy in what were then the American colonies. In 1763, after the so-called French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, the British Crown draws this red line down the Appalachians that you can see there. It's called the Proclamation Line of 1763. And beyond that line, Anglo-American settlers were not allowed to settle. They were legally prohibited from doing so. And the idea here was that the British Crown did not want settlers crossing into that territory, getting into conflicts with native nations, and ultimately perhaps dragging Britain into yet another war with France. This was a measure to try to sort of avoid any such costs that would be normally associated with such a war. So, of course, as we know, that proclamation line is essentially null and void as of 1783. The United States, then the colonies, they win their war for independence with Great Britain. And in the settlement, the Treaty of Paris, Britain gives to the United States the sort of light green territory you see on the map here, all its possessions up to the Mississippi River and north of Florida. So you then get this situation where there's a lot of new territory that individuals in these new United States that I think is theirs for the taking. And thus, indeed, post 1783, you see widespread settlement in Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana in particular. There were a lot more jurisdictional disputes farther south, and that made settlement a bit less attractive in some of those more southern territories. But in Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana, you have tens of thousands of settlers moving into those lands, trying to claim new bits of territory for themselves, as that was really the best method they had for sort of upward mobility in that setting. But of course, as we know, they're not moving into uninhabited territory. There are lots of native nations already there and who were not a party to that settlement at the Treaty of Paris. Britain just gave all this territory to the United States without ever giving native nations a say in any of those negotiations. And so you have a number of tribes that do not see themselves as having ceded that territory to the United States or anyone else for that matter. Now, this, as one might expect, leads to the formation of local militias, which attack native nations on and off intermittently throughout that post-1783 period. Such that you have ultimately about 1,500 settlers killed between 1783 and 1790, which I think speaks to both the volume of settlement going on in these territories, as well as the amount of violence being perpetrated here. Now, we have less reliable statistics on the native side, but they're probably roughly similar, perhaps worse. But at the very least, we can, with some reliability, say that about 1,500 settlers were killed in this time period. Now, in this time period as well, even though the United States saw this territory as its own possessions by right of conquest, they still thought it was most prudent to sort of engage in treaty negotiations with these native nations and try to sort of convince them to sell their lands to the United States. And so among the results of these treaty negotiations authorized under the time at the Articles of Confederation, we don't get the Constitution ratified and into effect until 1789. But you have the Treaty of Fort McIntosh that's signed in 1785 by some of the Ohio River Valley tribes, but not all of them. And it's the Shawnee and Miami in particular that are some of the most resistant to signing any sort of land cession treaties at this time, even though, as I say here, there are a number of treaty rounds throughout the rest of that decade in 1787, 88, and into 1790. Now, I'm going to sort of conclude this case study here with three different quotes from officials that were party to some of the decisions around the decision ultimately to initiate a war in this case. And one of the main players here is the Secretary of War. This was before the Department of War changed its name to the Department of Defense. So Secretary of War Henry Knox to George Washington in 1787, who's not president yet, but is still one of the more prominent elites of the day. Knox writes, "The whole Western territory is liable to be wrested out of the hands of the Union by lawless adventurers or by the savages. So the fear here that he and many other political elites felt was that either the settlers are going to win their conflicts with native nations in the West, and having done so without receiving federal assistance, they're going to not feel any allegiance to the United States, perhaps secede and create their own country. Or on the other hand, they're going to lose, and ultimately the United States is not going to be able to displace the native nations that it ultimately does want to displace in those territories. Now, the second quote I have here is from the Northwest Territory Governor Arthur St. Clair, again writing to Washington, who by this point is indeed the first president under the Constitution. St. Clair writes, "It is not to be expected, sir, that the Kentucky people will or can submit patiently to the cruelties and depredations of those savages. They are in the habit of retaliation." So here, St. Clair is trying to push Washington for military intervention in the Old Northwest, as they called it, in the Ohio region, because if the United States doesn't intervene militarily, these settlers are going to sort of take things into their own hands, and again, conflict is just going to get worse there. Settlers are essentially forcing the federal government's hand. That's what St. Clair sees as going on here. And then finally, in April of 1790, not long before war ultimately is authorized by Washington, Blue Jacket, who's a Shawnee leader, describes having received lots of different messages trying to seek negotiations from various messengers on the American side, from federal and local officials alike. And he says, "From all quarters, we receive speeches from the Americans, and not one is alike. We suppose that they intend to deceive us." And I think all of these collectively sort of speak to the extent to which American settlers had really undermined these efforts by the US federal government to try to sort of establish these treaty negotiations with the Shawnee, the Miami, and other Ohio region tribes. And so what you ultimately see here is a foreign policy making process in which the public, in the form of these settlers and the local officials in these new territories, who are increasingly lobbying the federal government for military intervention, they're playing a much more direct role in foreign policy than we normally think of the public as playing. And so if we sort of go to early U.S. foreign policy with the view or mindset that foreign policy is something that just the political elites do, we're going to be missing some important action on the ground. Now, this is just a portrait by an unknown artist, but probably a military officer of the Treaty of Greenville, which is the resulting treaty of the Northwest Indian War. After Washington authorizes it, there are a number of Shawnee and Miami victories actually early in that war. Those are some of the worst defeats that the US Army ever suffers in its history. But after a few more years, the United States raises a larger army and ultimately does prevail on the battlefield. And so the result is a land cession treaty of the sort that the United States had been pushing for the decade beforehand. Now, to come to the second myth here, we've gone through foreign policy being an elite process. The second myth of US foreign policy, I think, is that early US foreign policy was isolationist. And again, this is a very widely held belief. This narrative is quite often crafted from statements by George Washington and John Quincy Adams. George Washington, who famously in his farewell address tells the nation to avoid entangling alliances with European powers. And on the other hand, John Quincy Adams, who gives a speech summarizing his views on US foreign policy, cautioning that the United States goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Now, scholars quite often take these two data points, if you will, and craft an entire narrative around early US foreign policy such that we can call everything from 1783 or 1789 up to, say, 1898 as having been a period of isolationism in US foreign policy. And while I think that that might be sort of obviously incorrect to anyone who is familiar with the history of the dispossession of Native peoples, this has so much purchase that we have, for example, the recent foundation of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington, D.C. Sorry, this is a think tank that advocates for a more restrained American foreign policy. And it's called the Quincy Institute precisely because of that John Quincy Adams quote about the United States not going abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And likewise, in some of the foreign policy or international relations literature, we see portrayals of this early or roughly a century of US foreign policy as having been isolationist, even in books published in 2020. Charles Kupchan's Isolationism, what was just published last year, and portrays basically everything up until Pearl Harbor as having been a predominantly sort of isolationist period in US foreign policy. Or on the other hand, you have treatments of US foreign policy like Jeffrey Miser's 2015 Power and Restraint, The Rise of the United States, which continues 1898 to 1941. So when we talk about the rise of the United States and the beginning of an activist US foreign policy, scholars are quite often starting in 1898 with the Spanish-American War. Sometimes they go to Woodrow Wilson, and intervention in World War I, or sometimes, as Kupchan does, they don't really start thinking about an activist US foreign policy until 1941 or so. And what I'm going to suggest is that we ought to think that this is incorrect, and that, again, a conflict with Native nations can help to illuminate how exactly or why exactly we ought to think that that's incorrect. With this second case study here being that of the Second Seminole War. Now, as the name suggests, there is more than one Seminole War. The first one takes place from 1816 to 19. The third one takes place from 1855 to 58, but the most costly and deadly one takes place from 1835 to 42, and it is initiated under the presidency of Andrew Jackson, who sort of looked out at the state of the United States and saw a problem in his mind that was settler conflict with Native nations that were trying to hang on to their land. And his solution to this ultimately was the Indian Removal Act. The idea is that if we just move all these Native nations that are clearly fighting to hold on to their lands, if we can move them west of the Mississippi, then everything will be fine. I think, clearly something that was not well thought out logistically. This is why so many Native individuals die in the process of these removals. But this Second Seminole War is indeed one that is going to, or a conflict that is going to come about specifically because of this Indian Removal Act. And so in May of 1830, a little more than a year after Jackson is inaugurated as president, the Indian Removal Act passes Congress with narrow majorities in the House and Senate. But it's not until 2 years later, in January of 1832, that James Gadsden is going to be appointed by the War Department to negotiate with the Seminoles. So it's a fairly involved process, actually, once the Indian Removal Act is signed. It still takes a while for the War Department to try to implement this. Now, in May of 1832, after having these negotiations with the Seminoles, the Treaty of Payne's Landing is signed. And as there often was in these cases, there were disputes as to whether this treaty was valid in the first place, whether those who signed this treaty actually had the authority to do so and to say that, yes, we, the Seminole Nation, will remove to Oklahoma, or what is now Oklahoma. But nonetheless, the United States sees this treaty as valid. It is submitted to the Senate in December of 1833, but it's not ratified until April of 1834. And the terms of this treaty were such that the Seminoles were given 3 years from the signing of it to remove from Florida. And so the Indian agent, that is an agent of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Wiley Thompson, tells the Seminoles in October of 1834, so post-ratification, that they are going to need to leave Florida by May of 1835, right? The terms were that they had 3 years to remove from Florida. They signed in May of 1832, that those 3 years will have elapsed in May of 1835. The Seminoles point back to the ratification process and note that it was not ratified by the United States until April 1834, so they should have until April of 1837, should they not? And so this disagreement is ultimately not something that the United States under Andrew Jackson is going to countenance, that they are not going to bend on that April 1837 date. And so ultimately the military is going to be deployed to Florida starting in early April in early 1835. In April of that year, you're going to have an additional 16 Seminole chiefs who sign on to that treaty. But again, this is not everyone who would have needed to sign on representing the Seminoles. There are still a number of leaders within the Seminole Nation that are resistant to this idea of removal. And nonetheless, in October of that year, the remaining Seminoles are going to be ordered to gather in the Tampa Bay area for removal to Oklahoma. They'll be sort of shipped from there, essentially. And it's under those conditions, again, that sort of ultimatum ultimately being given to the Seminoles, at which point in late December of that year, the 28th, a small group of Seminoles ambushes a band of the US military that had been preparing to remove the Seminoles. This is ultimately the thing that that is usually marked as the initiating sort of act of the Second Seminole War. It's going to continue for another 7 years after that. It's sometimes compared to Vietnam insofar as this was something like a counterinsurgency campaign from the American side. The terrain in Florida is even swampier then than it is now. And so this is not something that goes very well for the United States. One of the more famous participants of this war, though, Osceola, pictured here, is someone who ultimately is captured and dies a few years into the conflict. But to sort of pull this back to this second myth of early US foreign policy that I'm trying to get at, this notion that we ought not to think of early US foreign policy as having been isolationist. Right. I think it's very difficult to look at this moment in which the United States is using all the tools available to it in the sort of military and diplomatic realm, all those typical tools of foreign policy to effectuate the removal of the Seminoles and many other Native nations around what is now the United States. It's quite hard to look at all that and say that these were acts of an isolationist country. regardless of the intensity of US ties to European countries at this time. I think we can safely say that it takes a very activist foreign policy, in fact, to effectuate the removal of Native nations in line with the Indian Removal Act, and ultimately to carry out more broadly the dispossession of Native peoples across an entire century, roughly, of US foreign policy. Now, to come to a third myth of early US foreign policy here, this third one again is that motivations are material. And again, here I'm referring to the idea that what motivates political action, what motivates foreign policy action in particular, is economic interest. And here you see that this kind of argument in both history and international relations. So this book, The Tragedy of American Diplomacy by William Appleman Williams, is one of the most highly cited works of history of the 20th century. It's something that starts its own school in diplomatic history. It's referred to as the Wisconsin School of Diplomatic History because Williams was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison at the time. And the idea here for Williams ultimately is that he has this sort of explanation for US foreign policy that relies on the open door idea, the notion that what guides US foreign policy, the first and main principle behind it, is that the United States wants an open door to trade with all other countries in the world. And so it is ultimately going to take whatever steps are necessary to ensure that those trade relations are kept relatively open and not protectionist throughout its history. Similarly, this kind of reading of history has been brought into international relations by way of Christopher Lane. His book, The Peace of Illusions, American Grand Strategy from 1940 to the Present, applies basically the same logic of the open door to American foreign policy in that post-1940 period. But like many scholars in international relations, he doesn't go earlier than that. He doesn't look at anything from 1783 onward. It's all sort of 1940 to the present. And while I don't want to diminish the importance of economic aspects of US foreign policy or economic motivations to it, I think that those very much are present. I think these kinds of explanations for foreign policy can ultimately get kind of monocausal insofar as they draw our attention to one factor and ultimately leave out other very important ones. And so for this last third case study, again, the sort of third main case study in the dissertation, which I think helps to dispel this particular myth of US foreign policy, we're going to Utah's Black Hawk War of 1865 to 72. So immediately after the end of the Civil War, this is ultimately going to flare up. But this happens in the context of early Mormon settlement in what is now the state of Utah. That starts to happen in the late 1840s after they flee from Illinois to the Great Basin region. So they had fled to Illinois from New York, first of all, and they're going to flee from Illinois again because of religious persecution. They're a heterodox denomination within Christianity, and they are ultimately not held in very high regard by most of their Orthodox Protestant neighbors. Joseph Smith, their founder, is ultimately going to be killed in Illinois, and that's one of the things that precipitates their migration further westward. But of course, again, they are not like all other settlers coming from these Anglo-American states. They are not settling in uninhabited territory. These new settlements in the Great Basin region are going to overlap with the homelands of multiple tribes, but most prominently the Utes and the Paiutes. And so this is a more sort of recent mapping, but This gives you some sense of some of the groups in this Great Basin region, some of which would have been more clearly overlapping or more tightly concentrated at the time of this Mormon settlement there. So again, going back to late 1840s and 50s. And as we saw in other places, there are initial skirmishes throughout the 1850s. But unlike in most other contests, these usually didn't get all that violent. We don't see as much violence here, for example, as we did in the Ohio Territory in the 1780s and 90s. And part of this was because Brigham Young, as the successor to Joseph Smith, was actually fairly successful in diffusing much of this conflict. He's often said to have gone by this dictum: it is, quote, cheaper to feed the Indians than fight them. And right, and this is basically how he would encourage his followers to diffuse conflicts with local tribes, rather than going out and trying to avenge the theft or killing of one's cattle, for example. Instead, perhaps try to understand the strained resources that they're dealing with, and perhaps offer them some of your cattle instead. We can sort of make do ourselves in our community while also trying to avoid more sort of escalatory violence here. That was the idea. This ultimately does work reasonably well for the Mormon settlers for about a decade or so, or maybe a decade and a half. It's in 1865 that a Ute leader named Antonga, he's often referred to as Black Hawk by the settlers and by later historians and such, but as far as we can tell, that's not a name he ever gave to himself. It's something that was sort of ascribed to him by virtue of a purported resemblance to another chief of a different tribe named Black Hawk. So Antonga, as I'll refer to him here, sought a meeting with some local Mormon leaders. And the reason for this at this particular time was that Antonga believed that the settlers had intentionally cast a smallpox epidemic, it's meant to say, upon them. Antonga's father in particular had passed away in a recent wave of smallpox. And as far as we can tell, the Mormon settlers were not, in fact, intentionally spreading smallpox, but that was the belief of Antonga. And so he is ultimately going to meet with a group of settlers in one of the settlements close to what is now Salt Lake City. And it's at that meeting that a settler interpreter by the name of John Lowry is going to get into a fight with Antonga, but no one is actually killed at that point. They just come to blows and go their separate ways after that. 2 days later, however, a group of Utes do ultimately kill a settler, and that is what is the sort of precipitating event, as at least the settlers see it, in what comes to be known as Utah's Black Hawk War. Now, it's not entirely clear why this particular event is what sets off this chain of events, but the next 7 years, again, 1865 to 72, these are years that would see scores of intermittent raids by settlers and native groups, one on and so this was ultimately a cycle that was very hard to disrupt. But what I think is especially interesting here from the perspective of someone who studies US foreign policy is the extent to which we're just talking about settlers and native tribes in this case. It is not ultimately the federal government that comes in and decides the war in favor of the settlers. Rather, when the federal government does finally intervene in 1872, they kind of get between the settlers and the local tribes. But they do so not so much to protect the settlers, but to assert federal authority over the Mormon community. So again, this is a heterodox set from the point of view of most in the government. They're seen as potential secessionists, and especially having just fought a civil war, this was something officials were quite sensitive to. Um, and so what the federal government ultimately does here is they disband the Mormon militia, which was one of the better equipped and better organized militias on the frontier. They arrest Brigham Young, and they install a non-Mormon territorial governor. And so I sort of go through this particular case study and link it to this myth that motivations are material, precisely because I think it shows the extent to which ideology, culture, identity all sort of work their ways into US foreign policy decision-making. This here is a portrayal of the killing of Joseph Smith. Again, this would have been late 1840s in Illinois. And I think it's not a secret, especially to historians, for example, that these sort of identity-based cleavages have shaped foreign policy for a very, very long time. But I think one of the things that scholars in international relations and US foreign policy are increasingly paying attention to over the past few years is the extent to which racism is involved in structuring US foreign policy decisions over time. We've already seen the dehumanizing language with which foreign policymakers have spoken about Native populations in some of the quotes I've used, and the extent to which that shaped US foreign policy and still shapes US foreign policy to this day is something that I think allows us to push back on the notion that we should locate the primary motivation for US foreign policy in economic factors, that this desire again for open markets above anything else. That's something that most foreign policymakers do believe is something the United States should pursue, but it's not the only thing structuring their decision-making. That's ultimately my argument. And so to wrap up here with some implications, I think the first thing, again, coming back to this idea that foreign policy is not just for elites, the foreign policy of the United States has not always been as isolated from public pressures as we seem to think of it today. If scholars do think US foreign policy is currently pretty isolated from public opinion, such that the public is basically just an audience at this point that can render judgment after foreign policy actions are taken, then that's something that has changed over time, and something that we should think about not as an inevitable or a sort of natural thing about US foreign policy. Now, the second key implication here is that the United States was never isolationist. Again, I think it's very hard to look at US foreign policy with respect to the dispossession and all these conflicts with Native nations over the course of more than a century and describe that as isolationist. And yet many in my field still do. Now, the third implication here is that explanations for US expansion should account for both material and identity-based motivations. It is not all about economic factors, I'm suggesting. Again, those cultural or ideological aspects also structure the making of foreign policy. And so these ultimately are the things that I think we can sort of reorient or use to reorient our view of US foreign policy if we focus more on US relations with Native nations and a bit less on US relations with European powers. Now, one of the things that Marnie suggested that I add at the end here are just some suggestions for future reading. So I have a list of some histories here, in particular on that first case study of the Northwest Indian War. I also have a list of some sources in foreign policy or international relations that I found especially helpful in doing this. But as I mentioned at the bottom there, I have sent out my dissertation to Marnie to distribute as she sees fit. So if you're interested in obtaining a copy of that and going through the entire bibliography, you're welcome to do so. You can also contact me at the email address down there, just my full name, Szarejko gmail.com. And I'm happy to share more ideas for sources or just take any questions that you may have on some of these topics. So with that, I will thank you once again for being here, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Okay, so let me get my computer happy. So it doesn't look so much like questions in the chat, just some comments, which I can read off. And if the commenter has a question follow-up, like feel free to jump in and let me know. But Steve Roach says, from the Shawnee perspective, the settler elites and commoners pretty much pursued the same goals. It was more concerns about how to do it. Clearly, many elites were land speculators. On the Shawnee side, elites also did not guide actions, but again, the goals were the same. The second thesis is clear. The U.S. was in no way isolationist, but militaristically expansionist. So just kind of a comment from...
If I can chime in there, and
yeah.
Steve, feel free to follow up, but I think on your first point there, I think you're exactly right. The notion that there's a distinction between the settlers and elites, I don't want to make too much of that distinction, because I think you're quite right. Both settler populations and political elites were very much interested in territorial expansion. I think you're right to say that the question for those in those two groups was a question of how exactly are we going to do this? In particular, how quickly are we going to try to advance this expansion? And so on the settler side, I think, as one might naturally assume to be the case, you had a group of individuals who was in general on the more sort of impatient side there. You had settlers who saw in these supposedly sort of free lands from their point of view, a chance to establish new, perhaps better lives than they had on the East Coast. And so they really wanted the federal government to come in and push Native peoples out sooner rather than later. And on the other side, for the political elites, war is a costly thing. Even if you think it can be a relatively quick war, even if you think the other side is relatively weak, which political elites often did in some of these cases, that is still a more costly thing to do, to go to war, than it is to bargain and ultimately get some land cession treaty out of that. And so I think just naturally from sort of where they were standing, you see settlers and political elites form these more and less impatient views of how US expansion ought to proceed. But there was never a question about whether the United States should expand. I don't think there were many individuals, certainly no significant people in power, who really doubted the virtue of territorial expansion.
Unmute. And so the next comment, like Petersman, there we go, is from Daniel Strongwalker Thomas. He says, from the Lenape, I'm really bad with pronunciations that I don't say out loud very often, point of view, the USA policy from 1750 to 1810 was to extirpate the Indians. In September 1778 at Fort Pitt, the U.S. commissioners met with Delaware leaders and negotiated the first written Indian territory in U.S. history. In doing so, they felt compelled to counter the charge that their government and its people intended to extirpate the Indians and take possession of their country. The allegation was a serious one. We would today call it genocide in the strongest sense of the term, the physical extermination of a group. The word extirpate did not mean simply to drive away or remove.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the interesting things in there is that, yeah, the United States is essentially conducting its own independent foreign policy as soon as, 1778, as you mentioned here, but even before that. So while the United States does not gain independence, of course, until 1783 and that settlement at the Treaty of Paris, it is making these overtures to other native tribes and sort of trying to bring some of them onto its side in its war for independence. And in some cases, ultimately, Native tribes do join with the United States to resist the British, only to then be sort of ignored by the United States in the aftermath of that war, only to then be sort of treated as a conquered people, even though they had fought with the United States in some cases. And so on the notion that US policy from 1750 to 1810 was to extirpate the Indians, to use the quote there. Yeah, I think right, the term genocide is a loaded one, but I think it's quite appropriate to sort of use that in this context. One of the books that I reference in the dissertation is a book by Jeffrey Ostler, who's a historian. I've got it somewhere around here, but I'm not seeing it at the moment, so I don't remember the title exactly, but it's something like Surviving Genocide or something like that. And so that's a source that I would certainly recommend, and which does portray the extent to which US policy throughout this period, he's talking roughly the first 100 years or so of independent US policy was genocidal toward Native peoples. But I think I'll leave my response at that.
Okay, next we have a comment from Chad. Thank you for your very perceptive and optimist way of looking at the U.S. foreign policy practices. I definitely agree your assertion that when looking through the lens of the U.S. interactions with indigenous nations, the U.S. has never been too isolationist, especially when considering the U.S. Constitution, Article 6, which implied that these indigenous nations were treated as, and by all means should be, international and sovereign entities, no matter the size of the nation in terms of population and territorial claims.
Yeah, again, that's, I think when I get questioned by scholars of international relations as to whether we should actually think about any of this as foreign policy or as international relations rather than just an aspect of domestic policy, that's exactly one of the things that I go back to, right? That this is, as per the Constitution, it's a government-to-government relationship. And for about, what was it, something like 80 years or so, the United States was making treaties with these tribes, just as it would treaties with any European power. And so I think part of the reason why scholars of US foreign policy have sort of ignored these histories for so long is because we tend to sort of think about US territorial expansion on what is now the United States, on the North American continent. We tend to think of that as something that's about domestic politics, as something that's just, I don't know, something entirely disconnected from foreign policy, which is more about what the United States is doing with relation to, again, England, France, Spain, those European powers from which it is often buying or sort of coercing more territory out of those states, as it does with respect to Spain in Florida in the 1820s. So yeah, I think that aspect of the Constitution, which remains in place to this day, that's I think a good reason for thinking about this as a foreign policy issue rather than as a domestic policy issue. And one of the papers that I'm working on now explores in a bit more depth this, I think, really interesting moment in U.S. Native relations in 1849, that is when the Department of the Interior is created. And it is at that point that the Bureau of Indian Affairs shifts from being in the Department of War to the Department of the Interior, where all these other things about, say, natural resource management, forestry and such, you have all those elements of the bureaucracy in place alongside Indian affairs. And so I think we've sort of, in the study of foreign policy, we sort of look through a sort of our present lens that tells us that Indian affairs is a domestic issue. It's part of the Department of the Interior, while sort of ignoring the fact that this was the subject of rather heated debate. It was not inevitable that Indian affairs would go into the Department of the Interior. There was heated debate on this in the Senate in 1849, with both sides arguing that Indian affairs was either naturally and obviously something that was part of foreign policy and ought to be in the Department of War, or at least the Department of State, or on the other hand, something that was sort of obviously and naturally part of the sort of interior development of the country, and thus sort of becomes treated over time and rhetorically sort of reinforced as a domestic issue over time.
Okay. Now we have a question from Elliot. Given the history of American expansion within what is now the United States, where did the idea that the United States pursued an isolationist foreign policy come from? Additionally, how did the Monroe Doctrine fit into the notion that the U.S. pursued an isolationist foreign policy, given that it contemplates an American sphere of influence within the Western Hemisphere? This would involve pushing European great powers out of the Western Hemisphere, right?
Yeah, it's a great question, really. And I think I'm not sure I have a perfect answer as to sort of how this becomes the standard disciplinary treatment of this entire period of time. But I think one of the things that you see even from current commentators in US foreign policy is this assumption that we can treat the entire world now, as the United States is the strongest power around, that we can treat the entire world as one big sphere of influence for the United States. And this is somehow appropriate or just because the United States is just the most enlightened great power around. And so we can be trusted with this great responsibility, but we could never allow, say, China or Russia to exercise a sphere of influence in their neighborhood. That would be illegitimate in one way or another. And so I honestly don't know how the people who sort of make that kind of argument sort of maintain that in their minds as something that is appropriate. I'm thinking in particular, if you're interested in the reading, there's a book by Robert Kagan called The Jungle Grows Back, I think, which is basically just an extended argument for a very activist US foreign policy. And he indeed has this argument that the United States should just maintain a sphere of influence that is worldwide, while denying any other power the right to a sphere of influence more narrowly. But I think on that first question on where this idea of the US ever having had an isolationist foreign policy comes from, I think this is ultimately part of debates that sort of work themselves out in the aftermath of World War II. One of the things that advocates of a more militarized, a more a more sort of internationalist or activist foreign policy use to support their claims for a more expansive foreign policy commitment in Eastern Europe, in Northeast Asia, for example. One of the arguments that they make is that our foreign policy was isolationist in the 1920s and 30s, and that is why World War II happened, because the United States didn't step in earlier and do something to check the rise of Hitler and his expansion in Europe. And so I think from that starting point, the sort of term isolationist or isolationism becomes something of a cudgel in these foreign policy debates. So if you argue for any sort of retrenchment or paring back of US foreign policy objectives, you're an isolationist, no matter how intense you ultimately want diplomatic relationships, for example, with other countries to be. So I think that's perhaps where this sense of US isolationism starts, with reference to that interwar period of the 20s and 30s, and then gets sort of grafted back onto the long 19th century by later scholars who, again, are focusing more on those relationships with European powers because, well, that's what great power politics is, right? It's what the United States and the UK and France do. The stuff of international relations for many scholars is ultimately about only the most powerful actors in the system. And so we can sort of set aside these smaller tribes on the North American continent. They're not great powers. And so if we sort of take that stance, as I think many scholars have, I think you sort of naturally end up with this, this viewpoint of US foreign policy such that, well, it wasn't doing all that much in Europe. So it must clearly have been isolationist. But with respect to that Monroe Doctrine, you're right. That is very much a very sort of expansionist claim that this entire hemisphere is ours, Europe, and you need to stay out of it. So I think, to be charitable to the sort of people who see this as a period of isolationism, they perhaps portray this as a statement that the United States doesn't want European powers coming into its hemisphere because it doesn't want to get involved in wars with European powers. But that ultimately assumes that the United States could credibly threaten to go to war with European powers if they did go into the Western Hemisphere and try to control territory there. And to make that kind of credible commitment is it's a sort of activist approach in itself. It's certainly not isolationist. So yeah, I think that those are excellent points, really.
Okay. Marnie has a question here. Could you describe the resources you found during your research that presented the Shawnee perspectives about U.S. policies and negotiations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the resources that I found for my dissertation research were those, of course, at the Shawnee Cultural Center, for which I'm forever grateful for the assistance in looking through those. But then also in a lot of secondary sources. There are a good number of histories on the Shawnee, specifically on the Miami people as well, and then on this particular war, the Northwest Indian War, in which they were involved, that I've talked about. And so I've mentioned Colin Calloway. He's, I think, someone to whom I look to a lot of his work to inform some of my own work. But then as far as some of the resources from the Shawnee Cultural Center, there were, I think, a lot of documents that you all had that were actually by like early geographers of like the mid 20th century or so, I want to say. And a lot of those got into very sort of fine-grained detail as to just the topography of the land on which the Shawnee and other Ohio River Valley tribes resided in this late 18th century period. And I think one of the things that was really helpful to me as someone who's sort of coming from US foreign policy rather than history was getting into that, again, more fine-grained detail that I can normally get from secondary sources. Just knowing sort of exactly sort of what the US military would have had to do, the 700 men or so that were in the military at the time would have sort of had to do to effectuate their plans in the Northwest Indian War. It was, I think, really helpful. I think a couple of the biographies that I mentioned in the suggestions for further reading were helpful as well. The one on Blue Jacket and Little Turtle. So you had the two most prominent Shawnee and Miami leaders typically associated with this conflict, both of whom have full-length biographies written on them, and which I would commend to anyone interested in some of this history.
Okay.
Thank you, Andrew. Doesn't look like there's any more questions. Oh wait, no, nope, that was my question. If you have any other further questions for Andrew, we can pass them on. Again, you can always contact us and we'll be happy to facilitate any other information that you would like. Thank you everyone for attending. Just again to talk a little bit about the lecture series, next month is Ed Herman from Indiana University about angel mounds, celestial alignments. And we're going to follow with a few more scholarly presentations, but actually then the presentation series is going to change a bit because it's all going to be mainly citizens speaking. So just to let you know how that's going to unfold in the future. So thank you again, and we'll see everyone later.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. And just to remind everybody, the recording should be available. It usually takes me about a week to get it all edited and up on with the captions and whatnot. And I'll post on our social media again once that's up and live. So if you want the information again or want to pass, have somebody that didn't miss out, it'll be available. I think I'm going to start pulling the information from the bibliographies at the end to a page on our website, which I'll figure out where that's going and let everybody know, just so it's easy to get to instead of having to go through the whole video. But yeah, thanks everybody. Really good discussion.